Have you ever seriously asked yourself what you would do if you lost it all? I don't just mean your money or your job. I mean everything that gives your life meaning, your family, your health, your peace of mind. And what if the architect of that ruin was the very same God you dedicated every single day of your life to? This isn't a hypothetical question. It's the story of a man God himself called blameless and upright, and it was precisely because of that righteousness that heaven gave hell a permission slip to unleash its fury upon him. His life was turned into a stage, and his pain became a spectacle for the entire visible and invisible world. In the land of Uz, before the bottom fell out, Job was the picture of divine blessing. His land stretched out as far as the eye could see, like a Texas rancher's dream. His herds were too numerous to count, and his home was filled with the laughter of 10 beloved children. But his greatest wealth wasn't something you could put on a balance sheet. It was a deep, reverent, and personal relationship with the Creator. Every morning he would consecrate himself, offering sacrifices, not just for himself but for each of his children. Just in case, he'd think, they have sinned in their hearts. It was a diligence born from a profound love and a faith that left no stone unturned. But while the smoke from Job's devotion rose to the heavens, a drama was unfolding in a celestial sphere, far beyond his comprehension. In the very presence of God, the accuser threw down his challenge, a poisoned doubt that would put the very nature of faith on trial. Does Job fear God for nothing? Satan questioned. Stretch out your hand and strike everything he has, and he will surely curse you to your face. Permission was granted. A silent decree sealed the fate of the most righteous man on earth, and Job, in his piety, had no idea he had just become the centerpiece of a cosmic wager. The peace of that morning was shattered by the sound of desperate feet pounding on the dry earth. A servant, his face pale with terror, collapsed before Job. The Sabaeans attacked. They've taken the oxen and the donkeys and killed your men. I'm the only one who got away to tell you. The air grew thick with dread. Job's heart, once a serene lake, felt the first violent stone break its surface. The initial shock, the disbelief, the mind scrambling to make sense of the senseless. But there was no time. Before we dive deeper into this abyss, I'd love to know where you're watching from. It's incredible how these sacred stories connect people from so many different places. Drop your city in the comments below. Knowing you're out there on the other side of the screen gives this whole thing an even greater sense of purpose. While the first servant was still catching his breath, a second one appeared, bringing another wave of devastation. The fire of God fell from the heavens and burned up the sheep and the servants. I'm the only one who escaped. The news came like body blows in a heavyweight fight, one after another, at a brutal, relentless pace. A third messenger. The Chaldeans took the camels and put your men to the sword. I'm the only one who got away. A lifetime of blessings was being dismantled in a matter of minutes, and Job could feel the ground giving way beneath him. Each word was a hammer blow, and he could barely stay on his feet under the weight of the avalanche of loss. And then, the final blow. The one that wouldn't just bankrupt his estate, but shatter his soul. The last messenger arrived, and his eyes held a different kind of horror, a pain that begged forgiveness for the words his mouth was forced to speak. Your sons and daughters. They were at their oldest brother's house, he began, his voice trembling. A terrifying wind, a real twister, came out of the desert. The house collapsed on them. All of them. They're all gone. I'm the only one who escaped. In that moment, an absolute silence fell over the land of Uz. Job's world didn't just crumble, it ceased to exist. Many men would have screamed, cursed, or collapsed in a blind rage. Job stood up. The sound that followed was the tearing of his robe, an act of visceral grief. Then, the silence of his head being shaved, surrendering his honor to the dust. And then, the unthinkable. He fell to the ground, and with his face in the very earth that had swallowed his happiness, he worshipped. Naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked I will depart. his voice came out, choked but firm. "The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. May the name of the Lord be praised." It was the purest, most painful declaration of faith ever spoken. Now, prepare yourself to witness what happens when that initial faith is tested not for a day, but through months of silent agony. Job's journey teaches us that true strength isn't about never falling, but about how we fight when we're on the ground, crying out for answers in the dark. You're about to discover how brutal honesty with God and confronting our own pain can become the very path to a life-changing encounter. The ordeal, however, went deeper. Permission was extended to touch his very flesh. Malignant, oozing sores covered his body from head to toe, a living torture that gave him no rest. The man of great wealth now sat on a pile of ashes, the ultimate symbol of desolation, using a piece of broken pottery to scrape at the itching and the pain that consumed him. His body had become a roadmap of his suffering. He was a spectacle of misery, an outcast in his own land, like a ghost haunting the ruins of his own life. It was in this scene of degradation that the last voice of comfort turned into a razor blade. His wife, worn down by the tragedy, looked at him with a mix of pity and contempt. "Are you still holding on to your integrity?" she said, her voice dripping with bitterness. "Just curse God and die already." It was the voice of logic, of despair, the voice that says there's a limit to what a person can endure. Job rebuked her, but her words echoed in the loneliness that followed. He had lost everything. Now he was being advised to throw away the one thing he had left, his faith. There, in the ashes, under a silent sky, Job's real battle was just beginning. The news of Job's ruin traveled on the desert wind, reaching his three friends, Eliphaz the Temanite, Bildad the Shuhite, and Zophar the Naamathite. They made a plan to go to him together, to offer comfort and sympathy. But when they approached and saw the figure sitting in the ashes, they barely recognized him. The man whose skin was a canvas of sores, whose body was bent under an invisible weight, was not the vibrant, prosperous leader they knew. He was the very image of pain. The shock was so great they broke down weeping, tearing their robes and throwing dust over their heads in a shared gesture of grief. Then, they sat on the ground with him. For 7 days and 7 nights, not a single word was spoken. The silence was a tapestry woven with threads of respect, shock, and a sorrow so deep that words seemed profane. The only sound was the whistling wind and the rasp of Job's pottery shard against his skin. In that silence there was a pure solidarity. It was the most honest form of compassion, an admission that in the face of such monumental pain, any attempt at an explanation would be an insult. They were simply there, sharing the weight of it all. But on the 8th day, the dam broke. Job opened his mouth, and what came out wasn't a prayer or a gentle lament, but a dark torrent of despair. He didn't curse God, as his wife had suggested, and the accuser had predicted. He cursed something far more intimate, his own existence. "May the day of my birth perish," he moaned, his voice raw with anguish, "and the night that said, 'A boy is conceived,' let that day be darkness. May God above not care about it, nor light shine on it." The words fell like stones in their midst. Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar exchanged shocked glances. The man who once taught others with wisdom was now cursing his own life. The silent compassion they felt began to curdle into a growing unease. In their minds, a simple black-and-white theology began searching for an answer. Suffering was the result of sin. If Job's pain was so immense that it made him wish he'd never existed, then his hidden sin must be just as monumental. The friend they came to comfort was, in their eyes, becoming a defendant. Eliphaz, the oldest and perhaps the most gentle in his initial approach, cleared his throat. He felt the need to restore order, to bring God back into the equation in a way that made sense. "If we venture a word with you, will you be offended?" he began, with a cloak of false modesty. "But who can keep from speaking? Think, Job, You have instructed many. You have strengthened feeble hands. But now trouble comes to you, and you are discouraged. It was a soft opening, but the blade of accusation was already being sharpened. Then he delivered the blow. Eliphaz spoke of a vision in the night, a spirit that whispered a terrifying truth to him. Can a mortal be more righteous than God? Can a man be more pure than his Maker? The argument was clear and crushing. No one is innocent. If God finds fault even in his angels, who was Job to claim he was pure? The unspoken conclusion hung in the air, cold and poisonous. Admit it, Job. You've sinned. That's why you're suffering. Repent, and maybe God will restore you. Have you ever felt completely misunderstood, judged by the very people who were supposed to have your back? It's a kind of loneliness that cuts to the soul. If you've ever had your pain met with accusations instead of an embrace, know that this feeling, this struggle, connects you directly to the heart of this story. You're not alone in that. Job listened, his body trembling not just from fever, but from a new agony, injustice. He lifted his face, and his hollow, weary eyes flashed with a spark of indignation. His response wasn't a theological defense, but a cry of raw pain. If only my anguish could be weighed and all my misery be placed on the scales, he cried out. It would surely outweigh the sand of the seas. That is why my words are so rash. He wasn't asking for logic. He was trying to make them feel the crushing weight that was suffocating him. He went on, his complaint turning directly to the silent heavens, to the God who remained hidden. The arrows of the Almighty are in me. My spirit drinks in their poison. God's terrors are marshaled against me. To Job, this wasn't random suffering. It felt personal. It felt targeted. He felt that God, his former friend and protector, had become his hunter. And that was the deepest wound of all, the betrayal that made all other pains unbearable. The first round of the debate ended with an even wider chasm between the men. The friends, clinging to their tidy theology of retribution, saw Job's response not as the lament of an innocent man, but as proof of a proud and rebellious heart. They came to offer the comfort of pre-packaged answers, but Job had shattered them with the brutal reality of his suffering. The compassionate silence was dead, replaced by a war of words that would only deepen the wounds and isolate Job further on his island of pain. The floor now belonged to Bildad, the traditionalist. He lacked Eliphaz's poetic subtlety. His words were direct, as hard as the desert stones. How long will you say such things? He demanded, his impatience obvious. Your words are a blustering wind. Does God pervert justice? Does the Almighty pervert what is right? For Bildad, the equation was as simple as a first-grade math problem, a truth passed down through generations. God is just, and God's justice is to punish sin. There was no room for exceptions, no space for mystery. Then, with a cruelty born from certainty, he applied his cold logic to Job's most sacred wound. When your children sinned against him, he gave them over to the penalty of their sin. Job flinched, as if he'd been struck. The death of his children, his most holy grief, was now being used as cold, hard evidence of guilt. Bildad didn't see a grieving father. He saw a case to be solved, a lesson to be taught about God's unbending righteousness. Job's reply was a mix of bitter agreement and raw desperation. Indeed, I know that this is true, he admitted, his voice dripping with painful irony. But how can a mortal be righteous before God? He began to deconstruct their theology, not with pride, but with the clarity that only extreme suffering can provide. Though I were innocent, I could not answer him. I could only plead with my judge for mercy. If I summoned him and he answered, I do not believe he would listen to my voice. Job knew that in a direct showdown, God's overwhelming power would render any defense useless. It was in this chasm of powerlessness that a deep longing bloomed in his soul, a need that went beyond proving his innocence. If only there were someone to mediate between us, he cried out, staring at the empty sky. Someone to lay his hand on us both. Someone to remove God's rod from me, so that his terror would not frighten me. He didn't want a lawyer to win a case. He longed for a bridge, someone who could understand both the majesty of God and the frailty of man, and who could bring them together. It was the cry of a son who felt hopelessly estranged from his father. Zophar, the third friend, couldn't take it anymore. He was the most dogmatic, the most impatient, and his intervention was like salt poured on Job's open wounds. Are all these words to go unanswered? Is this talker to be vindicated? He accused Job of mocking God with his speeches of innocence. Then he delivered the most horrifying charge of all. Know this: God has even forgotten some of your sin. In Zophar's mind, Job's catastrophe wasn't an excessive punishment. It was, in fact, an act of mercy. Job's patience finally snapped. He turned to the three of them, and for the first time, a spark of his old authority flashed in his tired eyes. No doubt you are the people, and wisdom will die with you, he said, the sarcasm sharp as a razor. But I have a mind as well as you. I am not inferior. Who does not know all these things you're saying? He accused them of spouting empty proverbs, of being, quote, worthless physicians, offering useless cures for a disease they couldn't begin to comprehend. Then Job pivoted. He silenced his friends with his contempt and turned to the only audience that truly mattered. With his face lifted to the heavens, he became the defendant, suing his own judge. In an act of defiant faith that would echo for eternity, he declared his final intention: "Though he slay me, yet will I hope in him. I will surely defend my own ways to his face." It was a statement of radical trust, not in his own survival, but in the ultimate justice of God. He was willing to die, but not before he had his day in court. That line from Job, "Though he slay me, yet will I hope in him," is one of the most powerful in all of Scripture. It speaks to a faith that isn't based on circumstances, but on the character of the one you believe in. Have you ever had to exercise that kind of stubborn faith in the middle of a storm? Share your thoughts with us in the comments. In his direct appeal to God, Job didn't ask for restoration. He asked for fair terms for his trial. "Only grant me two things, God, and then I will not hide from you. Withdraw your hand far from me and stop making me afraid of your terrors." He wanted a confrontation, but a fair one, where he could speak without being crushed by divine power. He was betting everything on the belief that behind the face of the hunter, the just God he had always known still existed. His appeal grew even more intimate, more moving. He reminded God of his own creation. "Remember that you molded me like clay. You clothed me with skin and flesh, and knit me together with bones and sinews. You gave me life and showed me kindness." It was the plea of a son to his father, contrasting the intimate care of the Creator in the past with the apparent cruelty of the oppressor in the present. "So why," he pleaded, "do you hunt me down now?" The cycles of debate continued, but they were at a complete stalemate. The friends, ever more convinced of Job's guilt by his refusal to repent, grew harsher in their accusations. And Job, having lost all hope of finding empathy in them, dug deeper into his solitude, polishing his arguments for the day he would finally stand before God. The desert air was thick, not just with heat, but with unanswered questions, and a pain that no human theology could explain or soothe. The days dragged on under the merciless sun, and the debate had become a vicious cycle of pain and accusation. The friends' arguments, once distinct, now blurred into a single nagging voice, repeating the same empty certainties. They spoke of a God Job no longer recognized, a divine bookkeeper who only dealt in rewards and punishments. The air was dry, the ground was cracked, and Job's soul felt that same exhaustion, that same thirst for something true. Compassion had completely evaporated, leaving only the bitter dust of conflict. It was then that Job decided to end it. He had no more strength to rebut their ignorance, no more interest in their theories. He would make one final speech, not for them, but as a final testament, a document to be filed in the courts of heaven. He drew himself up, gathering the last scraps of his dignity, and his voice, though weak, rang with the authority of a man who, having lost everything, had nothing left to fear. His courtroom would no longer be this circle of judging faces, but the entire universe. He began by describing the life that had been stolen from him, not to brag, but to paint the full picture of his loss. He spoke of the days when God's friendship was a protective tent over his home, when young men revered him and old men stood in silence in his presence. He remembered how he was a father to the orphan and a champion for the widow. "I was eyes to the blind and feet to the lame," he said, the nostalgia cutting through his voice. Each memory was a knife, highlighting the chasm between the man he was and the wreckage he had become. Then, his voice took on the force of a solemn oath. He began to list, one by one, the sins of which he declared himself innocent, calling down curses on himself if he were lying. "If I have walked in falsehood, let God weigh me in honest scales, and he will know that I am blameless. If my heart has been led by my eyes, or if my hands have been defiled, then may I sow and another eat. If I have rejected the cause of my servants, what then will I do when God confronts me?" It was his closing argument, a direct challenge to his friend's simplistic, bumper sticker theology. And then, the grand climax of his defense. With a trembling hand, he made a gesture in the air, as if signing an invisible document in the dust. "Here now is my signature," he declared, his voice thick with emotion and conviction. "Let the Almighty answer me. Let my accuser put his indictment in writing. Surely I would wear it on my shoulder. I would put it on like a crown. I would give him an account of my every step. I would approach him like a prince." He wasn't just asking, he was demanding that the charges be formalized so he could answer them, not as a criminal, but as a nobleman before his king. A heavy final silence fell over the group. Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar were done. They weren't convinced, but they were defeated. Job's integrity was a fortress their words could not breach. They fell silent, because he refused to fit into their tidy worldview, because he was, quote, righteous in his own eyes. The conversation, at last, was dead. The case was closed, with no verdict, and Job's solitude seemed absolute. But it wasn't. A new voice, young, passionate, and filled with a restrained anger, shattered the silence. It was Elihu, who had been there the whole time, listening quietly out of respect for his elders. Now he couldn't hold back any longer. His anger burned in two directions, at the three friends, for failing to find a real answer yet still condemning Job, and at Job for justifying himself rather than justifying God. Elihu launched into his speech with an energy the debate had lost long ago. He didn't come with the same tired, retribution-based theology. He rebuked the friends. "You have found no answer, and yet you have condemned Job." Then he turned to Job, and his critique was subtly different. "You say I am pure, but you are more concerned with proving your own righteousness than with understanding God's. Does God owe you an explanation?" His intervention was like a window being thrown open in a stuffy room. Elihu introduced a radically new idea. What if suffering isn't punishment? What if it's a tool? "For God does speak, now one way, now another," he said. "In a dream, in a vision of the night, he opens the ears of people and terrifies them with warnings to turn them from wrongdoing and keep them from pride." Suffering, in Elihu's view, could be God's chisel, a painful but redemptive instrument used to shape and save the human soul. Elihu's words changed the atmosphere. He didn't claim to have the final answer, but he did what the others had failed to do. He lifted everyone's gaze. He stopped looking for blame on the ground and started pointing to the majesty in the sky. He spoke of God's greatness shown in nature, in the cycle of the rain, the power of the thunder, and the vastness of the clouds. He wasn't trying to explain Job's pain, but to put that pain in its proper perspective, that of a tiny man before an infinitely great, mysterious, and sovereign God. The stage was being set, the human discussion was over, the divine answer was about to begin. As Elihu's speech ended, the air grew heavy, electric. The clouds on the horizon, once a distant detail, began to churn and thicken, forming a dark funnel cloud that moved with an unnatural speed. The wind, once a whistle, became a roar, kicking up sand and dust in a veil that blotted out the sun. The four friends shrank back, shielding their faces. This was no ordinary sandstorm. This was an arrival. Job, however, remained standing, his frail, broken body exposed to the rising power of the whirlwind. His summons had been answered. Then, from the heart of the storm, a voice spoke. It was not the voice of a man. It had the rumble of thunder, the depth of the ocean, and the power to shatter mountains. The voice offered no words of comfort, no explanations. It came as a direct challenge, a rebuke that shook the heavens. And it was aimed at Job. Who is this that obscures my plans with words without knowledge? The question echoed across the desert, and in an instant, the entire structure of Job's arguments, defenses, and accusations was leveled. He had wanted to put God on trial, but God's first words put his presumption on trial. The voice continued, with the force of an avalanche. Brace yourself like a man. I will question you, and you shall answer me. The reversal was total and overwhelming. Job, the plaintiff, the man demanding answers, was now on the witness stand. The judge he had summoned to court had decided to cross-examine him first. In Job's heart, terror mingled with a strange, overwhelming peace. The silence was broken. The God who seemed absent was here, in all his terrifying and magnificent presence. The showdown he had longed for had finally arrived. God didn't talk about sores or loss or human justice. He took Job on a dizzying tour to the dawn of time. Where were you when I laid the earth's foundation? Tell me, if you understand, who marked off its dimensions? Surely you know. On what were its footings set, or who laid its cornerstone, while the morning stars sang together, and all the angels shouted for joy? Each question was a hammer blow to human arrogance, a demonstration of the infinite gap between the Creator and the creature. Job's mind reeled. He had wanted to argue his case, to present the evidence of his blameless life. Instead, he was being quizzed on cosmic engineering and astrophysics. He, who couldn't even grasp the reason for his own wounds, was being confronted with the secrets of creation. His personal pain, which had been the size of his entire universe, suddenly seemed like a single grain of sand on the shores of God's vast design. The desire for justification gave way to a feeling of absolute awe. He no longer wanted answers. He just wanted to survive the revelation. The torrent of questions continued, relentless. Have you ever given orders to the morning, or shown the dawn its place? Have you entered the storehouses of the snow, or seen the storehouses of the hail, which I reserve for times of trouble? What is the way to the place where the lightning is dispersed, or the place where the east winds are scattered over the earth? God was revealing to Job that the universe doesn't run on the simple human logic of merit and reward. It runs on a wisdom so deep and complex that Job's mind couldn't even begin to scratch the surface. The lesson went deeper, moving into the animal kingdom, especially to the creatures untouched by man. Do you hunt the prey for the lioness and satisfy the hunger of the lions? Who sets the wild donkey free? Will the wild ox consent to serve you? The ostrich flaps its wings joyfully, but they cannot compare with the wings and feathers of the stork. God was showing Job a world that did not revolve around him, a world that was wild, free, and mysterious, that existed and flourished for reasons that belonged to God alone. Life was so much bigger than the experience of one man, no matter how righteous he was. Then, the voice paused. The whirlwind still churned, but the interrogation stopped for a moment, leaving a question hanging in the air. Will the one who contends with the Almighty correct him? Let him who argues with God answer him. The opportunity was given. God, having demonstrated his infinite wisdom, was essentially asking, "All right, Job, after all that, do you still want to proceed with your lawsuit?" The ball was back in Job's court. Job, trembling, lifted a shaky hand and placed it over his own mouth. His body was broken, but now his soul and his pride were too. The vision of God hadn't given him the answers he thought he wanted, but it had given him the answer he needed. He saw himself for what he truly was, a speck of dust trying to command the wind. With his hand on his lips, he replied in a whisper that could barely be heard above the storm. I am unworthy. How can I reply to you? I put my hand over my mouth. I spoke once, but I have no answer. Twice, but I will say no more. But God wasn't finished. The lesson needed one final seal. The voice spoke again from the whirlwind, this time describing two creatures that embodied untamable power and apparent chaos: Behemoth, the land monster, and Leviathan, the sea dragon. Can you pull in Leviathan with a fishhook, or tie down its tongue with a rope? Any hope of subduing it is false. God was revealing that he was sovereign not just over order and beauty, but also over what, to man, appears to be chaos, evil, and uncontrollable power. And if Job couldn't even control God's creatures, how did he dare to judge the Creator himself? Job's understanding was complete. The vision of Leviathan, the creature of chaos that was, to God, just another animal in his magnificent and untamable creation, shattered the last piece of his old worldview. He finally understood that he had tried to put a leash on the Creator of the cosmos, to measure the ocean with a thimble, to judge sovereignty based on his own finite pain. The issue had never been about justice on human terms. It was about the very nature of God, a nature so vast, wild, and sovereign that the human mind can only bow in awe. He opened his mouth one last time, and the words that came out were no longer of complaint, but of pure worship and surrender. I know that you can do all things, he whispered, as tears washed the dust and ashes from his face. No purpose of yours can be thwarted. Surely I spoke of things I did not understand, things too wonderful for me to know. It was a total confession, not of a specific sin, but of his own limitation. Then came the line that defined his transformation, the very heart of his redemption. My ears had heard of you, he said, looking up at a sky that now seemed clear and close. But now my eyes have seen you. He finally grasped the difference between knowing about God, the sterile, second-hand theology of his friends, and knowing God in a personal, overwhelming, and life-altering experience. He had traded his knowledge for a revelation. Therefore, he concluded, his voice breaking with humility, I despise myself and I repent in dust and ashes. This wasn't the repentance of a criminal who gets caught, but of a son who finally realizes the depth of his own arrogance in the face of his father's greatness. He repented of his presumption, of his attempt to put God in the defendant's chair. He returned to the ashes, the place of his misery, but this time, not as a desolate victim, but as a broken worshiper. The storm ceased, the wind fell silent. The voice was gone. In the profound silence that followed, there was a peace Job's world hadn't known for a very long time. His friends were speechless, their theological certainties smashed to pieces by a divine appearance that couldn't have cared less about their well-constructed arguments. And Job, there in the dust, was finally whole. His transformation was complete. Then, God's attention turned to the friends. The voice, now without the thunder of the storm, but with an unshakable authority, spoke to Eliphaz. I am angry with you and your two friends, because you have not spoken the truth about me, as my servant Job has. It was the final vindication. Job's honest, questioning, suffering faith, with all its complaints and challenges, was deemed more true in God's eyes than the orthodox, pious, and accusatory faith of his friends. God gave them a command that was a humbling and redemptive role reversal. So now take 7 bulls and 7 rams, and go to my servant Job and sacrifice a burnt offering for yourselves. My servant Job will pray for you, and I will accept his prayer and not deal with you according to your folly. The man they had judged as a cursed sinner was now to be the priest who would intercede for them. Their acceptance before God now depended on the prayer of the very one they had scorned, and they obeyed. The three men, once so full of themselves, went humbly to Job with their sacrifices, and Job, without a trace of bitterness or resentment left in his purified heart, prayed for them. He forgave them. In that act of intercession, Job's own healing became complete. He was no longer defined by his suffering or his loss, but by the grace he could now extend to others. His pain had emptied him of himself so that he could be filled with God. Job's journey ends with a stunning restoration, but the greatest blessing wasn't the restored wealth, it was the unforgettable vision he had of God. This story reminds us that even in the silence, the pain, and the apparent absence, God is weaving a purpose far greater than we can comprehend. If this story has touched your heart, share it with someone who needs to hear that faith isn't the absence of questions, but the courage to keep seeking, even when you don't understand it all. And after Job had prayed for his friends, the Lord restored his fortunes and gave him twice as much as he had before. His family and friends returned, bringing comfort and gifts. 10 more children were born to him, 7 sons and 3 daughters, and nowhere in all the land were there found women as beautiful as Job's daughters. He lived another 140 years, long enough to see his children and their children to the 4th generation. But his true net worth was no longer measured in sheep or camels. It was measured in the scars that told the story of a man who dared to wrestle with God, and in losing the fight, won the ultimate prize, to know his Redeemer face to face.